Welcome. Today we're beginning an exploration of a case that, for decades, really captured and frankly disturbed the American public. I'm talking about the criminal conviction and the very complex life events involving the former teacher Mary Kay Letourneau and her student Vili Fualau. Our goal here today is to move past the sensationalism. We put together a really comprehensive set of sources, court documents, biographical articles, research all, to build a clear, fact-based timeline. Now, this material details statutory rape, a conviction, and this unusual and highly publicized relationship that followed. We have to acknowledge right up front how challenging this subject is. And while we're committed to presenting the facts impartially, we also have to emphasize the profound documented harm that was inflicted on the victim, Vili Fualau, as the sources make very clear.
That objective approach it's absolutely essential. Our examination today is all about analyzing this case through a strict factual lens. We need to understand the environment that shaped Letourneau before the crime happened, the precise legal timeline, the implications of her imprisonment, and then all of the later developments in their lives right up until her death in 2020. And the facts from the source material are, well, they're unambiguous. Letourneau was 34 when the criminal relationship began. Vili Fualau was just 12 years old. That age gap and, of course, the immense power imbalance of a teacher-student relationship, that's what led to her conviction on 2 counts of felony second-degree rape of a child. And that conviction just fundamentally changed the course of so many lives.
Okay, so let's unpack those background details first. To really understand what happened, we need to look at Mary Kay Letourneau's origin story. She was born Mary Catherine Schmitz in Tustin, California back in 1962. And she grew up in a very large family. She was the third of 7 kids. And what all the sources describe as a strict Catholic household.
And that environment, it was also heavily influenced by public life. Her father, John G. Schmitz, was a pretty well-known figure. He started out as a community college instructor, but then he became a prominent Republican politician in California.
His career was pretty significant, wasn't it?
Oh, very. He served as a California state senator, then he moved on to become a U.S. congressman, and then, most notably, he ran for president in 1972.
For the American Independent Party.
Exactly. So that's a staggering level of public scrutiny for a family to grow up under.
It really is. It suggests a family dynamic that was just constantly under a microscope.
Precisely. And this high-pressure, very public life also coincided with some deep personal trauma, according to what we've read. When MKL was just 11 years old, she experienced a terrible tragedy. In 1973, her 3-year-old brother, Philip, he drowned in the family pool. At the time, MKL was reportedly the one minding him, playing with another brother nearby.
And that event is mentioned as a major psychological turning point for her, isn't it? She claimed it really fractured her relationship with her mother.
Yes, exactly. She later stated that even though no one was ever formally blamed, her mother, who had assigned her the task of supervising her younger brothers, she said her mother became cold toward her after that. So this trauma, combined with what she perceived as blame, or at least distance, would have really contributed to a complicated emotional foundation long before she was an adult. The sources suggest this was a deep, ongoing issue in the household.
The family complications didn't stop there either. Her father's career and the intense pressure of his public image, it all came crashing down pretty dramatically in 1982.
That scandal was explosive, and it has a relevant, almost cyclical element to it when you look at the whole story. John Schmitz's political career ended for good after it was revealed he had fathered 2 children out of wedlock.
With the former student?
With a former student from Santa Ana College.
Wait, I need to pause on that for a second. Does the source material draw any clear, explicit line or parallel between her father's affair with a former student and her own eventual actions with a student?
The sources don't spell out a direct cause and effect, no, but they absolutely highlight the intense hypocrisy and the very public nature of that betrayal, especially within the family's strict religious and political framework. Her father's actions led to her parents separating, though they did eventually get back together. But the whole affair introduced this concept of a relationship with a power imbalanced teacher and student into her immediate, highly publicized family history. Sort of frames the environment she grew up in.
Okay, moving on to her own personal life. She met Steve Letourneau while they were both at Arizona State University. And this relationship also started under less than ideal circumstances.
It really did. The sources indicate that she became pregnant and they only got married because of significant social pressure at the time. They both acknowledged later that neither of them really had deep romantic feelings for the other. The pregnancy itself was also deeply complicated. There was a miscarriage of a twin embryo early on, though the surviving twin became their first child.
So they both dropped out of ASU. They moved to Alaska first, where Steve worked for an airline, and then they transferred to Seattle. And it was in Seattle that MKL pursued her own career, getting a teaching degree from Seattle University in 1989. It seems like she was looking for some structure through education.
But that structure didn't really translate to stability at home. The marriage is described as miserable, just characterized by constant strain. There were chronic financial problems, and both of them had extramarital affairs. And the sources also contain some really serious allegations about the conflicts in the marriage.
What exactly do the sources say about those conflicts?
Well, MKL's attorney, David Girk, he claimed that she was emotionally and physically abused by her husband during the marriage. The documents note that police were called to their house twice, and MKL went to the hospital for injuries twice, though no charges were ever filed against Steve Letourneau. But regardless of the legal outcome, it just paints this picture of intense marital volatility. And this was the backdrop leading right up to the events of 1996. The couple eventually divorced in May 1999 while she was in prison, and Steve got custody of their 4 children.
And this unhappy marriage was the context for when her professional relationship with Vili Fulau began. In 1989, MKL started teaching second grade at Shorewood Elementary in Burien, Washington. She first met Fulau in September of 91 when he was 8 years old and in her class.
And the source material is really consistent on this point. MKL was highly regarded by other parents. She was considered a very skilled teacher. She apparently identified Vili Fulau's artistic talents very early on and maintained a relationship with him, sort of cultivating his abilities even when he was no longer her student.
So that extended connection, which started innocently enough, is what allowed the boundaries to blur over time.
Right. And the relationship really intensified when MKL became Fulau's 6th grade teacher again in the fall of 1995. She was 33, about to turn 34, he was 12. And this period also lines up with another painful moment in her personal life. She had a miscarriage in her marriage in January of 1996.
And by the summer break of 1996, the relationship had crossed the line and become criminal. The sources placed the first instance of statutory rape in June of 1996. And this is where that profound power imbalance becomes actionable harm. She was 34. Vili Fulau just turned 12.
There's also that widely reported detail from People magazine. It noted that Vili Fulau had apparently bet a friend that he would have sex with her, which suggests a very complex dynamic. But regardless of any adolescent boasting, MKL was the adult. She was in the position of authority, and she was the one who chose to engage.
And the sources are very, very clear that the authorities actually had a chance to intervene almost immediately. The first encounter with police happened less than a month after the relationship began. It was June 18, 1996. They were found together in a car parked at a marina.
This specific incident it's just a critical moment of systemic failure. When the patrol car approached them, MKL was seen scrambling from the back seat to the front, and Fulau immediately pretended to be asleep in the back. The deception was instantaneous.
And the lies they told were pretty elaborate. Clearly designed to hide what was really going on.
Absolutely. They both gave false names. And Vili Fulau, who was only 12, lied and said he was 18 years old. The officer, however, he noted there was no ID, no driver's license, and he deduced that Fulau was not an adult. So the officer had clear suspicions right away.
So what was her explanation? What did she tell the officer?
She claimed that Vili was just a family friend who had seen a terrible argument she'd had with her husband, that he'd gotten upset and run away, and she, as his trusted adult friend, had just gone out to find him and comfort him. It was a calculated, prepared story.
So how did the police handle this? I mean, it's a clearly suspicious situation.
They called his mother. The sources indicate that Mrs. Fulau knew MKL as Vili's teacher, and just tragically, she trusted the story. She believed MKL was just helping a distraught kid, so she allowed Vili to go home with her. The police, either because they bought her story or because they just didn't investigate the age discrepancy properly, they dropped the whole matter.
That just seems like an unbelievable missed opportunity for intervention.
It was. Mrs. Fulau later expressed immense regret over it. She said that if the patrolman had just told her that MKL had specifically lied to the police about her son's age, she would have never allowed MKL back into Vili's life. That failure to share the complete context of the deception really sealed the immediate path forward.
And that path led directly to the pregnancy. By September of 96, MKL discovered she was pregnant with Fulau's child. And the secret finally fell apart when her husband, Steve Letourneau, found love letters between his wife and the young boy in February of 1997.
After that discovery, a relative of Steve's contacted the police, and that led to MKL's arrest on March 4th, 1997. She was formally charged with 2 counts of felony second-degree rape of a child. And while she was awaiting the legal process, she gave birth to their first daughter on May 29, 1997.
The prosecution, they initially went for a severe sentence.
Yeah.
7.5 years in state prison. But they ended up entering into a plea agreement. How much was the sentence reduced? And what were the absolute core conditions of that deal?
The reduction was astonishing. The plea deal resulted in a sentence of only 6 months in county jail, and 3 of those months were suspended. It also included 3 years of court-ordered sex offender treatment. And crucially, under this initial agreement, she was not required to register as a sex offender.
And the conditions, I remember the critique was all about how this was the most fundamental part of the deal.
It was the linchpin. The court was absolutely explicit about this. MKL was subject to a lifetime no-contact order with Vili Fualaau. She was also prohibited from contacting her own 5 children from her marriage or any other minors. But that no-contact order for life was highly unusual and very specific to the severity of this case. For the state to offer such a light sentence, the guarantee that she would never contact the victim again was the essential protective measure. The whole thing hinged on her sticking to that one condition.
The timeline here it surprises me every time I read it. She was out for barely 4 weeks. She finished her initial 3 months in jail, got released on January 2nd, 1998. Just 32 days later, February 3rd, 1998, she was caught by police. Again in a car with Vili Fualaau near her home. What did the sources say about the planning that led to such an immediate, blatant violation?
The source material really suggests this wasn't some impulsive decision. Her actions, the moment she was stopped, they indicated a clear attempt to continue the deception and maybe even flee. When police stopped the car, she immediately claimed she was alone. Both she and Fualaau gave false names.
But the evidence the police found showed undeniable planning, right?
Yes, absolutely. When police searched the car, they found a collection of items that pointed directly to preparing for an extended flight, or at the very least, a continuous violation. They found $6,200 in cash, which, if you adjust for inflation, is almost double that today.
Wow.
Her passport and numerous items of baby clothes.
That amount of cash and a passport just 4 weeks after being released, It sounds like she was preparing to disappear.
It reads exactly like that. And on top of that, police found receipts for about $850 worth of clothing purchased just since her release. And these receipts were specifically for men's, young men's, and infants' clothing. When they confronted her, MKL had counter-explanations. She claimed the cash was for dermatology treatments and divorce lawyers, that she just liked wearing oversized men's clothing.
Right.
But the prosecution successfully argued that all the evidence together, the cash, the passport, the clothes for Fualaau and their daughter, it clearly showed an intent to violate the no-contact order and possibly flee.
And was there evidence that sexual contact had already started again?
So while the police said they didn't have evidence that intercourse happened in the car during that specific February incident, MKL herself admitted in later interviews that she did have sex with Fualaau in January, after her release, but before that February arrest. So regardless of the exact moment, the violation of that legally binding order was absolute and immediate.
And the legal consequences this time were swift and severe.
Yes. The judge immediately revoked that initial plea agreement. He deemed her a direct threat to the protective conditions of her release. So the court reinstated the maximum sentence allowed for her original charges, 7.5 years in state prison. The message was clear. The court was not going to tolerate her deliberately flouting the order that was meant to protect the victim.
So she served her sentence at the Washington Correction Center for Women from 1998 to 2004. And her high-profile status made her time there particularly difficult.
Indeed. The source material notes she was very unpopular with the general inmate population because of her crime. And what's more, her behavior inside the prison led to significant punishment. She reportedly sassed guards and balked at work, and that resulted in her serving a total of 18 of her first 24 months in solitary confinement.
18 out of 24 months in solitary. That shows an incredible level of defiance against the prison rules, even in that isolated environment.
It does. In one specific case, she was sentenced to 6 months in isolation just because letters she tried to send to Vili Fualaau were intercepted by prison staff, which, again, proved her continuing legally prohibited fixation. She also gave birth to their second daughter while she was imprisoned on October 16, 1998.
Despite all the punishment, she did engage in some activities within the facility.
She did. She was in the prison choir, she tutored other inmates, and she created audiobooks for blind readers. And sources note she rarely missed Mass. But the isolation continued in other ways. Her request for a temporary furlough to attend her father's funeral in 2001 was rejected.
Okay, we absolutely have to shift the focus now. If we're really going to understand the whole picture, we have to dedicate time to the experience of Vili Fulau during these years. He was the primary victim, and he was the one grappling with the long-term consequences of the crime and all the notoriety.
This is probably the most painful part of the source material to read. While MKL was serving her sentence, Vili Fualau's life was just spiraling. He dropped out of high school, which completely interrupted his education. And because he was still a minor when the children were conceived, his mother was legally granted custody of their 2 young daughters.
But the personal trauma went far beyond just interrupted school and family instability. Sources document a really intense psychological and emotional struggle.
They detail his profound battle with suicidal depression and alcoholism. And the most critical data point provided is the documented suicide attempt in March of 1999. This happened just over a year after MKL's violation and her maximum sentencing. We really cannot underscore this enough. These consequences, dropping out of school, struggling with alcohol, attempting to take his own life, this is concrete evidence of the catastrophic, life-threatening emotional trauma that was inflicted on him as a child by this crime.
The focus has to remain on the victim's experience. And it's also important to talk about the attempt his family made to seek justice outside of the criminal courts through a civil action.
Yes. In 2002, Vili Fualau's family sued the Highline School District and the city of Des Moines. They argued that these entities failed in their duty to protect him from MKL. The lawsuit sought significant damages for emotional suffering, for lost future wages because of his lack of education, and for the very real costs of raising the 2 children born from the crime.
What was the core legal argument they were making?
The family essentially argued that the school district was negligent. They didn't have adequate policies to prevent these kinds of teacher-student relationships. And, more specifically, they argued the city police were negligent back in June of 1996 for failing to act decisively when they first found the pair and realized MKL was lying about his age. They believed the police had a legal duty to intervene more aggressively once that deception was clear, and they failed to do it.
Given the clear evidence of harm, the children, the suicide attempt, the fact he dropped out of school, you would think the civil case would be straightforward. What happened?
Despite a 10-week trial that laid out the full extent of the psychological and financial toll on Vili, the defense was ultimately successful. The defense for the city and the school district argued that MKL's actions were the sole intervening cause of the harm. The jury found that the institutions were not legally responsible for preventing the crime or for the emotional distress that followed. No damages were awarded to the Fulau family.
That failure to get any civil justice must have been just another layer of profound trauma and injustice for him, especially while he was still struggling with serious mental health issues. It really highlights how difficult it is for victims in these kinds of power imbalance crimes to find any kind of holistic justice.
Absolutely. The victim was left carrying the full weight of the emotional and financial fallout, the responsibility for the children, the depression, the alcoholism, with no legal or institutional financial support to help him mitigate that long-term damage. And this was despite the fact that his abuser was a convicted felon. This deep failure in the civil system just compounded the trauma during his most formative years.
So Mary Kay Letourneau was released from prison on August 4, 2004 after serving her full sentence. The next day marked the start of her new life under very strict supervision. She registered with the King County Sheriff's Office as a lifetime Level 2 sex offender.
This is a point that it needs a bit of technical clarification for everyone listening. Registering as a Level 2 or medium risk sex offender for life is a significant constraint. It means she wasn't classified as low risk, but she also wasn't considered likely to reoffend under the high-risk conditions of a Level 3 offender.
And what are the specific requirements for a Level 2 offender that would have restricted her life and movements after she was released?
The requirements are pretty intrusive and they're ongoing. Level 2 offenders are subject to periodic mandatory check-ins with law enforcement, usually quarterly. Crucially, they face employment restrictions. Certain jobs, especially any that involve unsupervised access to minors or vulnerable populations, are completely off limits. And most significantly, Level 2 status requires neighborhood notification. Police have to notify local schools, daycare centers, and other community organizations that an offender is living in the area.
So that ensures a persistent level of public scrutiny.
Exactly. And that was obviously amplified in her case because of the notoriety.
And despite this immense scrutiny and that original lifetime no-contact order, this is where the legal timeline takes its most, unprecedented turn. Vili Fulau, who had now reached the age of 21 and was a legal adult, successfully petitioned the court to reverse the lifetime no-contact order that was put in place to protect him.
And this action, coming from the victim himself, legally removed that protective barrier. It represents a profound legal challenge to the court's original intent. The order was designed to prevent MKL from maintaining the relationship, but once the victim became an adult and asked for it to be removed, the court had very little choice but to grant it. The person the protection was for was asking for it to be dissolved.
And less than a year later, on May 20, 2005, they were married. The location was a winery in Woodinville, Washington. The event was a huge media spectacle. Exclusive access was given to Entertainment Tonight.
The wedding itself really cemented the controversy and raised immediate questions about culpability and responsibility, especially given some of MKL's public statements after she was released.
What exactly did she say about her guilt and her knowledge of the law?
She gave several interviews, one with NBC News, where she tried to define her own moral and legal understanding of what she did. She conceded that she knew it would be wrong to let the relationship go any further after the school year ended, which suggests she understood the ethical boundary. But at the same time, she claimed that it did not cross her mind at the time that having sex with Fualau would actually constitute a crime.
That seems like a real attempt to separate the ethical violation from the legal one. How did she defend that position later on?
In another interview, she was even more explicit about it. She said, and I'm quoting here, if anyone had told me there is a specific law that says this is a crime, I did not know. Had I'd known this would count as a crime, I wouldn't have done it. This position, framing her defense around ignorance of the specific penal code rather than recognizing the inherent abuse of power, was highly, highly scrutinized, especially by those who had studied the psychological impact on the victim. It suggests a persistent inability or refusal to accept the ethical gravity of the action itself.
Despite the origin, the intense public scrutiny, and the legal shadow over them, the marriage between MKL and Vili Fualau lasted a surprising 14 years.
That longevity, it certainly complicates the narrative for a lot of people looking from the outside. However, the internal strain became publicly visible near the end. In May of 2017, Vili Fualau filed for a legal separation, though he did later withdraw that filing.
But the separation was inevitable, it seems. They finalized a legal separation agreement in August of 2019. By this point, Mary Kay Letourneau was working as a legal assistant, which adhered to her Level 2 restrictions, and Vili Fualau was working at a home improvement store and had a side career as a professional DJ.
And throughout their 14 years together, Fualau often took a very public stance. He would vehemently defend the relationship, stating he was not a victim, that he was unashamed. This is a common, though very complex, response in cases that involve trauma and attachment dynamics that are established during childhood.
But the sources indicate that his public stance shifted pretty significantly after the final separation. And this is a really crucial detail for understanding his recovery process.
It is. According to reports from a source close to Fualau in May 2020, after the legal separation was final, he had achieved a new perspective. The quote states, he sees things clearly now and he realizes that this wasn't a healthy relationship from the start. That ability to finally gain an objective perspective, decades after the initial crime and after the relationship itself had ended, it just underscores the immense psychological weight he had been carrying.
And Mary Kay Letourneau died shortly after that separation was finalized.
She died on July 6, 2020, at the age of 58, at her home in Des Moines, Washington. The cause was colorectal cancer. Sources note that Vili Fualau and her family were present with her when she died, and she left a significant portion of her estate to him in her will.
This case really went beyond the courtroom, didn't it? It became this pervasive cultural phenomenon, a symbol for the breakdown of boundaries and the complex nature of attraction and abuse.
The cultural footprint was immense. In 2000, while MKL was still in prison, the TV movie All American Girl, the Mary Kay Letourneau story, came out, which just shows the immediate, intense public appetite for this story.
And the story has continued to echo through mainstream media. The opening of the 2012 film That's My Boy was reportedly inspired by the case. And Vili Fualau himself reportedly felt that film was directly referencing his experience.
And more recently, the critically acclaimed 2023 film May December is also widely seen as being loosely inspired by the structure of their story. It focuses on a couple whose relationship began with a teacher-student sexual crime and the challenges of their marriage years later. It just suggests the case continues to be a template for exploring these really uncomfortable truths about power dynamics.
The complexity of her legal journey is something worth just synthesizing one last time. from felony charges to a controversial plea deal, immediately followed by a violation that got her the maximum sentence, and then ultimately the reversal of the protective order by the victim himself, which allowed the marriage. It's just a very unusual legal roller coaster.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this case forces the legal system to grapple with the challenge of these power imbalance crimes, where the victim, once they're a legal adult, voluntarily chooses to be in a relationship with the perpetrator. The law is there to protect the child, but once that child becomes an adult, their autonomy often supersedes the court's protective interest.
Which raises a really important question. When a crime involves such a profound power imbalance teacher and student, how does the court differentiate between a genuine consensual choice once the victim is an adult and the long-term influence of the trauma and the attachment dynamics that were established during the criminal period?
Well, the sources strongly suggest that trauma deeply complicated Fulau's perception of the relationship for decades. That intense emotional bond, established under conditions of control and secrecy while he was a child, is what psychologists would term a powerful attachment dynamic. So even if Fulau petitioned the court willingly to lift the order, that doesn't erase the documented trauma, the suicidal depression, the alcoholism, the failed civil suit, which are all direct results of the criminal act that started the relationship.
The fact that Fulau spent years publicly insisting he wasn't a victim, only to realize after the separation that the relationship wasn't healthy from the start, that provides the ultimate evidence of the psychological cost. It shows that clarity and maybe genuine consent might only be possible much, much later after that cycle of attachment has finally been broken.
We have to keep circling back to those concrete human costs. The severe emotional distress, the attempt at self-harm, the disruption of his education, and the responsibility of 2 children he fathered while he himself was still a child. These details from the source material keep the focus squarely on the profound and lasting impact on the victim. This case reveals just how difficult it is to enforce protective orders against willing parties once the victim is a legal adult, especially when you consider the severe psychological trauma they suffered during the criminal period.
Our analysis of these sources really compels us to consider the lasting impact of notoriety in criminal action on everyone involved, even decades later. It leaves us thinking about how long the shadows of trauma can last, and how an event that begins as a clear crime can evolve into a legal and psychological puzzle that really challenges our understanding of justice and of recovery. Thanks for listening.